Okay, we're in the 9th chapter of the book of Romans. We're about verse 11, 12, like that, in the 9th chapter. Now, I want to give a little introduction to this section. This is a section in Romans that has been misinterpreted, misused, and misapplied just about more than any other section. And it is because people use it to promote their own ideology instead of listening to what Paul has to say. And that's true of so much of the misuse of the biblical text. People go to it with a predetermined idea, conception, and read it that way. Number one, warning, caveat. Paul is not talking about individual salvation here. This passage has little or nothing to do with individual salvation. He is talking about what the Germans call the Heilsgeschichte, the holy history, the plan of salvation. And that means the plan that God had in mind before the foundation of the world. It is the plan that Isaiah the prophet has God representing. God is saying, I know the end of something before I start it. That is not your individual salvation or mine he's talking about. He's talking about this plan of redeeming and reclaiming the creation that Paul talked about over in the 8th chapter of Romans, that it was subjected to meaninglessness, King James vanity. And so when he talks about these things, he's talking about that plan and the people that are active for him or against him in that plan. Are you with me? And so, keep that in mind. We're talking, see, we just finished the idea of the birth of Isaac, all that. Let's start at the 10th verse. And that's not all. When Rebekah was pregnant, and although the unborn children had a common father, Isaac our ancestor, and even though the children had not yet been born, nor done either good or evil, that is, unborn children can't do either good or evil, according to Paul here. Don't use that as about how sin comes to the next generation. He's not talking about that. He's talking about they hadn't done anything as human beings. Now, this isn't a discussion of what the fetus can do. We know from x-rays and sonograms and things that babies, before they're born, some of them cry. They suck their thumb. I've seen pictures of that. But that's not what he's talking about. He is talking about they haven't contributed to God's plan one way or the other. And God said that the elder would serve the younger. This happened in order that God's selection might be based not be based on works, but on His will alone. Now that's the key idea. As God works His plan, as God arranges history and even changes history, He is working on a plan. One of the key crisis points in this, and it's very much on my mind because I've just translated the version that Mark does, and that's Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he prays, and the way I had put it, please, if there's any way, take this cup of suffering away from me. Nevertheless, it is your will that will be done and not mine. Now that was that's the key right there. The whole plan of God boiled down to that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it was depended on Jesus. The human Jesus had to undergo the pain, the shame, the humiliation, the utter lostness of sin. And as a human being, he had rather not do that. And which one of us could not identify with him that way? But notice what he said, your will be done and not mine. Now that is what this passage is all about. I don't mean directly all about, but it's that kind of thing. And all through the Old Testament, God is working this plan. He is working it through Abraham. He made a covenant with Abraham. Remember, keep that phrase in mind, so that my name may be honored among the nations. That was the purpose of electing the Jews. That was their real job, was to behave in such a way that the surrounding nations would know that there was a God in Israel who was the real God. Know that he was full of glory and power and holiness. And they flunked the test. That's what Isaiah says. Instead of making my name glorified among the nations, you've made it a byword. You've made them curse me instead of bless me. And that was the failure of the Jewish nation. But one Jew came along and fulfilled that covenant obligation. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. And all the nations of the world have been benefited by his work. And in every nation that I know of on the earth, I know that in Bhutan, most of you couldn't put your finger on a map of Bhutan. It's between Nepal, India, and China. There's a little bitty spot there up high in the Himalayan mountains. We had some people who were refugees from Bhutan, and the church helped them. And mine and I were on the team that helped them. So I know there's some Bhutanese that glorify the name of God. That's what we're here for. That's the reason we become the living presence of Jesus in every neighborhood, is so that the name of God may be glorified. See, that's what he's talking about here. So he says, this happened so that God's selection might not be based on works, but on his will alone. That is, God doesn't trust anybody else to carry out the plan. It's his will. And he selects the people through whom that will be done. And therefore he knows it will be done. It may be done by rascals. It may be done by sinners. It may be done by a prostitute in Jericho, but it will be done. Now that's what all of this is about. God's plan cannot be successfully opposed. I don't care who it is. I don't care if it has hydrogen bombs and death rays or whatever on its side. It will not succeed in overcoming the plan of God. That is the basis of our hope, the basis of our security, that God's will be done. Our choice is whether we will join on the good side or join on the side of opposition. Know this, however, if you're on the side of opposition, you're going to be whooped completely. Now, I've tried to really drive this home because many people read this passage and they say, well, God saves some people and God causes some to be lost. It's not even talking about that. I hope you can see that. It's talking about the plan of God. Now, here it comes. This is confirmed by the scripture that says, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. Now, when was this said?
Genesis 25.
Are you sure?
That's where I looked it up.
Yes, okay. It is said there. But this was a long time afterwards. This is a historical statement and not a prediction. And it means Jacob, I selected him to do my will, and he did it. Esau didn't. Now, you can speculate all why God chose. I've heard all kinds of speculation. Everything that you say is speculation because it does not say anywhere in the Bible.
Charles, in some of the stuff that I was reading there, instead of saying loved and hated, it said accepted and rejected. Is there a better translation?
I would say that if I were going to translate that again, I may, in fact, when I go back through Romans, I may use those words. But remember that the Hebrew word for hate covers a lot of territory. And some Hebrew scholars, of which I am not one, say that it just means loved less. And so there probably isn't an exact English equivalent for it. And that word hate,
It's just got some context.
yeah. Do you know that people will say God loves the sinner but hates the sin? Well, that won't hold water, because there's places where it says God hates those who shed innocent blood. It's people. So whatever it is, whatever kind of emotion, and remember, we have a record of God feeling a certain way, and that's an anthropomorphic. That is, if he were a human being, that's what you would call it. But we don't know. God is the great unknown. The idea is that nobody has ever fully known God except the Son. And that was one of the claims he made while he was on earth, that nobody knows the Father except the Son. Nobody has really ever seen him except the Son. And so remember, give God the benefit of the doubt. You won't be very much wrong if you do. But this is, as I've said, notice I used the past perfect. I have loved and I have hated. It's a historical statement after the fact. And it describes not just the two people, but the descendants of them. What?
It's a present perfect, not a past
Uh,
perfect.
Present perfect, you're right, but it is a perfect tense. If it's past perfect, it would have had in it. Thank you, my English teacher. I don't know why I said past perfect. It is still a historical.
It connects the past with the present. That's how it's used in English.
It's a record of what has happened. Okay, how shall we respond to these things? Now, notice Paul knew that when the people at Rome read or heard this read, they would have a gut level reaction to it. So, in typical Pauline fashion, he argues the argument before they do, so that he shows them that he understands their response. How shall we respond to these things? We won't charge God with acting unjustly, will we? And then his famous me genoito. Absolutely not. Whatever you do, and however you interpret this, don't charge God with being unjust. He is absolutely just.
He doesn't act with prejudice.
What?
He doesn't act with prejudice.
Yeah. And that's, by the way, even the Apostle Paul, as privy as he was through his direct contact and teaching from Jesus with the mind of God, he does not go behind that statement. He does not go and explain it, because he didn't understand it completely any more than you and I do. There are some things that we might want to know, but you know what? Maybe there's some things that we can't know. There are some aspects of God, and this is what God told Job when he appeared to him in the whirlwind, the tornado. He says, Job, here are some things that you don't know. And he says, if you don't know these basic things, how can you know my mind? I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty accurate paraphrase. And so we are curious. In fact, one of the things that God put in us is curiosity. That's the reason the first man went up over the mountain to see what was on the other side. I tell you what, I can remember when mine and I could hike up in the mountains, did hike. We hiked 9 miles. Every one of them was above 9,000 feet. If I did that, I would take 3 steps and fall dead today. If I got to 9,000 feet, I'd fall dead. But I can look back in longing at those days. I always wanted to know what was on the next, over the next hill, around the next curve. We have started out at times on a road that we didn't know where it went to. Remember one time up in the mountains in Colorado, and we really got into it because our car was brand new, and this road became nothing but big rocks and boulders, and I had to steer from one rock to another to make sure I didn't drag the oil pan off of the car. But it was worth it. When we got way up in the mountains, there was an active beaver pond, and we sat there for an hour and watched the beavers make the dam. And that was worth it. If I'd have drugged the bottom out of that car, it would have been worth it. But by then the road was better. So that's curiosity. That's the reason the human race progresses in technology. That's the reason that the world has been explored. And so it's a gift from God. But There are some things that our curiosity will never be satisfied until we see him face to face. And then we'll know. We'll know all that God wants us to know, which will be a lot more than we know now. He says, how shall we respond? And then one of the rhetorical questions, we won't charge God with acting unjustly, will we? Absolutely not. Because Moses says, I will show mercy toward those I choose to show mercy, and I will show compassion toward those whom I choose to show compassion. Do you see anything different about this statement than the ones that have been made before?
I chose and will.
Yeah, but there is something more basically different.
I will.
Oh, it's future tense.
I will.
What?
It's future tense instead of.
That's one basic. It is future, but both things are positive. The others have had a positive and a negative.
Oh, yeah.
You see that? Paul wants us to go positive about God. God, what he wants us to know is that the same actions that may lead to unwanted things are true about mercy and grace and justice. And I'm going to use a word that you will think I'm denying the statement that God is just. God is not fair as human beings count fairness. But you better be glad he's not.
That's right. Grace is not fair.
Grace is not fair. And that's brought out in the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where he paid all the workers the same price, even though they had worked differently. I remember the first time I ever preached on that to an audience that didn't know me. That was the lectureship at the Christian College west of Philadelphia. I can't think of the name of it now. York. Is it? No, that's not York. Whatever it is, anyway. And I was on the preaching at King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, by the way. There is a town called King of Prussia. What was that?
There's a mall there too, right?
Yeah, there is a mall. A big mall. I preached this and about that parable, and then I came to this point. Our whole salvation depends on God not being fair. Now notice, I'm not saying he's not just, because he worked out on the cross the conflict between justice and mercy. That Paul is going to say that, but I'm talking about fairness, as we, kindergartners know about fairness. That's not fair. Teacher, make him be fair. And this is what he's getting at here. God will show mercy and compassion on those that he wants to. Now, notice it doesn't say upon what grounds here. The grounds of him showing mercy is whether or not you trust in the work of Christ on the cross. That's the basis. He doesn't say it here, but he has said it in Romans before, and he's going to say effectively the same thing again. That's the sole basis, whether you trust in the work of Christ. Those who do, God graciously shows compassion. If you don't, he doesn't. Therefore, God's selection does not depend on either human will or striving. Now that's the important point that he's getting at. God selection and his selection for the plan. Now, we could extend this to his selection and salvation, but that's not what he's talking about here. God's selection for whether or not you will, what side you will participate on in his historical plan, doesn't depend on human will. You cannot will and decide you're going to help God with his plan. It doesn't depend on striving. You cannot get on God's side of the battle between good and evil because you do a lot of work. See, but these are the phrases that make many people apply them to individual salvation instead of the plan of God, which obviously it is.
I've always had a really hard time with the phrase, he hardened their hearts, like, because it goes contrary to what we've been taught about how if we would just do as God says, we'll receive these gifts of salvation and so forth. So he must know their hearts enough to allow them to be.
Well, let me tell you, the example he's going to use here is Pharaoh.
Right.
And if you read the story of Pharaoh, there's about as many times where it says Pharaoh hardened his heart as there is when it says God hardened his heart. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. I know one thing it means. It means that whatever it is that God does that's called to harden his heart, the person whose heart is hardened has responsibility for it.
Right, so it's kind of like, it's not an issue of a person not having freedom of will. It's more like they're taking that choice and God's allowing it to happen.
That's one way to look at it. But there's holes in that if you push it too far. It's just the same way, and I've talked about this. Paul one place says, it's not I that work, but the Spirit who's working in me. And I like N.T. Wright's exegesis of that. He says that what that really means is that Paul couldn't tell when it was his will and God's will. That he just knew that it depended on the Spirit and on his own will. And I'm going to say, and I don't want you to think I'm comparing myself to Paul when I say this, I have found that to be true. I have found times when I felt very much led by the Spirit, and I could not tell whether because I chose or because the Spirit chose. That you find that out.
One thing that occurred to me this week, it was a little bit of a revelation, is I've been studying Matthew in another Bible study and seeing Jesus' interaction with the scribes and Pharisees as opposed to the Gentiles and the sinners, and how the Pharisees and the scribes continually hardened their hearts in their challenge against Christ. And ultimately, you have the judgment on Jerusalem in 70 AD, as opposed to the mercy shown to the sinners and the tax collectors, who are then eventually, the Gentiles are engrafted and the church goes out. So you see that blessing and curse, or the redemption and the judgment playing together there.
Yeah, you see, the problem is here, we are at the limits of human understanding. We have to remember that. And that's what Paul means when you say you're not going to charge God with being unjust. God forbid. Because we cannot get outside of God and look at his actions objectively. I've used this before. People think they can think about their own death. Do you know you can't conceive of your own death? I mean, it's an absolute impossibility. Because when you conceive of your death, you're standing outside watching it. Think about that.
Well, you're putting yourself in the position of God, I guess.
Yes, you see, but you will be on the inside experiencing it. But since you never have experienced it before, you don't know what it's going to be like. I came to that conclusion, I don't know, before I was 15, probably 12 or 13 years old. I was just sitting one day halfway listening to the sermon, and the preacher said something, and I said, you know, he can't know that. I was a snotty little thing. Mina, when she was younger, she pointed that out more often than I liked. Took me a long time to realize I needed her. But anyway, I just thought to myself, and I sat there the rest of the sermon, I don't know what he said after that. That was good experience for a man that's going to be a preacher, because you know that people are going to do that to you. But anyway, I had that kind of mind. I said, because you visualize watching it, and that therefore you're not experiencing it, because you don't know what it's like. And we're like that at this place, this interface between God and man. We are right at the absolute limit of what we can conceive of. In fact, Paul is talking about things that's just past that limit. Are you following me in that? And that means that we're not going to answer all the questions. We're not going to be able to comprehend all of it. I'm sure it's a lot like it's a lot like children. They see things that they can't conceive of and understand because they're just not at that point yet. Okay.
We're micro trying to understand macro.
That's one way to put it. Another way is we're finite trying to understand the infinite. That's a good figure of speech there.
Charles, I'm reminded of the passages in Luke where Christ tells the disciples to suffer the little children to come unto him. And he said, unless you're like a child, you cannot enter the kingdom.
That's right.
And it fits in your point about the limits of human understanding. Children, in my experience with my own children, and my own experience as a child, is we reach the limits of what is a good decision and what is a poor decision. Mm-hmm. Often we need the guidance of the parent to guide us to the right, in the right direction.
Yes, that's very good. Thank you, Hope. Okay. For Scripture says to Pharaoh, I have raised you up for the purpose of demonstrating my power, and so that my name might be proclaimed to all the world. Notice, that's what I said the Jews were supposed to do. God's actions are aimed at getting his name proclaimed to the world. Now, that's today that's the function of the church, to get his name proclaimed and known all over the world, and his mighty deeds, his grace, his mercy, his power, all over the world. Now, to do that requires some people to oppose God, so that God can do what to them? Overcome them. Have you ever thought about it that way? That Now, he doesn't have to choose people to do that because Satan takes care of that. Satan just can be called, one of the, what Hosatanas could be called the opponent, the accuser, the opposition. The opposition is there, but individual people become servants of the opposition. That's what Pharaoh did. He represented the opposition to God. And God demonstrated his power. Every one of those plagues that God sent on the Egyptians were representatives of some one of the gods or goddesses of the Egyptians. Every one of them. They worshiped a god. They had a bullfrog god. They had a locust god. I'm not kidding. They had all these, and every one of them. So God was demonstrating his power over the Egyptians.
You know, one of the big issues in Joshua that Max is getting ready to talk about is God's insistence that his people completely destroyed these cultures that they conquered.
Mm-hmm.
And women and children seems completely unreasonable to us, but I think it was a picture again of God saying it is not in your best interest to resist him.
Yes, and you've got your finger right on it.
Also with the story of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, we have a place where a man's heart was hardened, and yet there was a redemption after that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know that with Pharaoh,
Mm-hmm.
but you still have that same play of God using someone that was thought by everyone to be evil, and yet he had a point of redemption later.
I had a very close friend when I was at Rice. It was a professional atheist. You know, not all atheists are professionals. And I told him one time, I said, "You don't know enough to be an atheist."
How did he take it? How did he take that?
After a while, he almost admitted it. Because here's my reasoning. If you don't know everything, the thing you don't know may be God. And he would not claim to know everything. Now that's more a debater's trick than it is convincing, but it's true. Okay, I am real happy with the way we've done this passage because it is a passage that many people, in the past I've had teachers that just kind of skipped over this. Yeah, just, you know.
Yeah. I would just say, I mean, I guess I'm coming from a Calvinist point of view, and that studying the doctrine of election or sovereignty of God brings me great comfort because it all goes back to God. It's all from him, to him, and it just completely glorifies him and just takes me out of the picture. I am utterly depraved, and I'm okay with that. That when you can come out of the other side of all this is unfair, this doesn't make sense, it is a beautiful picture of God's character.
Yes. Here's the thing. If you haven't read my book, but if you had, I come out with the fact that passages that make everything depend on God are passages addressed to people who were needed to know that. And passages that emphasize choosing it was in the context of getting people to choose. And I've compared that to the fact that if you do an experiment to show that an electron is a particle, it will act like a particle. And if you do experiments to show that an electron is a smeared out wave-like thing, it will be a smeared out wave-like thing. And so God's the same way. When he thought people needed assurance, he told them, look, you can be sure because I'm in control. And when he thought they needed to choose, like Joshua does at the end of Joshua, he choose you this day whom you'll serve. He thought they needed to make a choice. And so what God is really like, we don't know any more than we know what an electron is really like. That's my argument in my book.
And then even this morning, in our lesson this morning, that priest had to choose to stick his big toe into this raging water. You know, he had a choice. And it is a mystery.
By the way, at that time of the year,
Responsibility and-
the Jordan River water is right chilly. Went with a group of Baptist believers. I had a little group, only 9 people, and that was too few to have a separate transportation, and also they put us together with a group, Baptist church from south of Fort Worth, and they all wanted to be baptized again in the Jordan River. Well, I stuck my toe in and decided I'd been baptized enough.
What month was that, John?
What? June?
June?
Yes. The water was pretty cold. I tell you what we did, though, on that same trip. We waded through Hezekiah's tunnel. Do you know Hezekiah's tunnel? It's mentioned as digging a tunnel. And the tunnel runs from a spring outside the walls of Jerusalem to the pool of Bethesda inside the walls. And we walked it from the outside to inside the wall. And this was in early June. And they told us if we rolled our pants legs up above our knees, we wouldn't get wet. Well, this was the heaviest rainfall that Israel had had in 75 years or something. And my belt got wet. And the water was cold. And we had a guide walking in front of us with a big 5-cell flashlight, and a guide walking behind, and the woman behind us, her light went out. And you talk about eerie. It got pretty dark, and the roof got closer to the water, and the water got closer to the roof. And I thought my claustrophobia began to tick, but just about the time I was ready to say, the roof began to get higher, and we got out. But I was chilled to the bone. Mina didn't go. She had good sense. But that was my curiosity. Okay, let's get back to this. My power, so that my name might be proclaimed to all the world. Therefore, God has mercy on those he wants to show mercy, and hardens those he wants to harden. Now, what Paul is emphasizing is it is the will of God. And if you can't work that out, just accept it as Scripture. And be glad that you're are a believer. Okay, now, we'll go on because we've got at least 10 minutes. Therefore you will ask, why then does God keep on blaming us? Aha! That is very human. Why should I be blamed for something I don't understand? Okay, because, this is going to sound redundant, because you are to blame.
So you're doing something wrong without knowing it? Is that what you mean?
Well, you can, but how many of us don't know that a lot of the things we do are wrong? I do. And I still do some. I'm not going to get impatient with my children. I am going to be more understanding of my wife or husband. I'll never do that again. Do those phrases sound familiar? See? Convicted out of my own mouth. That's that reason I say the reason God blames us is we're to blame. We do things that we know. You remember what Paul says in Romans 7 when he has this wrestling with his conscience? I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. That shows, he says, that part of me knows what God wants me to do. And yet I keep doing them. O wretched man, who will deliver me from this body of death, of sin? See, that's what he's talking about here. That God blames us because we are to blame. For who can stand against the will of God? See, it's easy. And by the way, you talk about coming from a Calvinist background. That was the objection when Calvinism was nearly the only theology of churches in this country back in the early days. The rebellion was led by people who said, well, why should I accept blame for something I didn't know about? And it was the Enlightenment talking. The Calvinists and the enlightened people guided by the Enlightenment battled for the soul of this country for 100 years or more. And guess what? It was what's called a Mexican standoff, which I've never understood, but I've used it. I hope it's not casting aspersions on Mexican people. You could just call it an English standoff. Or
Stalemate.
Yes, better than that, a stalemate. And this country is a mixture. It still is spiritually a mixture of that battle. And I guess it will go on until both the Calvinists and the non-Calvinists stand before Christ, and those that are faithful will be admitted, whether they're Calvinist or not.
Are you talking about the Campbell debates?
What?
Are you talking about the Campbell debates?
That was part of it, yes. I didn't have that particularly in mind, but Alexander Campbell did. He debated what's his name, Owen, the semi-socialist who established semi-socialist enclaves in this country. Robert Owen, I believe. Was it Robert?
Yep.
Yeah, was? Okay. Thank you. I've read it, but I couldn't remember. All right. Who are you, O human being, to talk back to God? I always have this picture when I get right here of a early teenage child going to the principal's office. I had a brother next to me, 13, 14 months younger than I, that he just could not resist talking back. Tell you what he did. He discovered when he was in high school that the school grounds went to the middle of the street in front of the high school, and that it was on the other side of the street, it was against the rules to smoke on school ground. So he'd go across the street and light up and stand with his toes 1 inch from the center line and blow smoke toward the principal's office. And he stayed in trouble all the time. I was smarter than him. I just didn't let people know what I was doing. Smart aleck. So that's the idea here. You can't talk back to God and win. And it is like talking back to somebody who loves you and who acts in your behalf. We do that, you know. We talk back to people. I'm a fan of cop shows on television. And you see people that, especially in traffic stops, and the policeman has stopped them because they are endangering their life and other people's lives. And yet, so many of them have that chip on the shoulder, just don't like the police. Well, I've been stopped for doing things. Got a ticket for driving 60 miles an hour in a 30-mile limit. I didn't know that we were way out in the country. It was one of those little towns that expand their city limits.
And their budget.
What?
And their budget.
Yeah, in their budget, that's right. And so I was just going like, it went right past him and waved at him. Until that was in Michigan. So our time is just about up. I'm going to let you have a minute or two because we're at a good stopping point, Alicia.